Oftentimes, when you hear discourse, especially on the right, talking about the future of the United States, you hear what is colloquially called the Blackpill, which is essentially a term, for those of you who are probably familiar with it, but for those of you who are not, it's essentially a term for a kind of pessimism about the future or a pessimistic outlook on society. And whenever someone tries to offer an antidote to this, it's called the white pill, this idea of you just being optimistic and you being hopeful about the world. And sometimes this is taken in a negative way because folks will accuse you of attempting to sugarcoat and cover up what's going on for the sake of some toxic, hopeless, or rather hopeful optimism that things can be different when the reality of something says the opposite. But what if I told you optimism does not have to be toxic? What if I told you that despite the trials and tribulations that America is going through right now, our better days are ahead of us? What if I told you that pessimism is a choice and it is oftentimes a result of tunnel vision inflicted by an unwise filtering and interpretation of what you are seeing on your phones or on your computer screen when you open up your news apps? What if I told you there is a strong case to be made for the future of American optimism? Before I get into all of that and make my case to you, my friends, hello. I am Christian Watson. Thank you guys so much for being here. I am your host. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must urge you, please subscribe, like, share, do whatever you can. This message is so important for the future of our country, for the future of the West, and also for the future, I think, of any thinking person who values the principles and the ideas embodied in our great republic. So I would appreciate all of you helping out. I would appreciate all of you sharing and liking and doing whatever you can if this message most certainly pleases you. Now on to the video. So optimism, as I mentioned, doesn't have to be toxic. It can actually be rational, it can actually be good. Because to be optimistic does not mean to ignore the flaws of reality. I'll be the first person to say that America has a lot of problems. I'll be the first person to say that the current system of American justice, where people are targeted for their political opinions, as opposed to the universal pursuit of justice, which are meant to be blind and stand above those things, is concerning. I'll be the first to tell you that the decline of American privacy, which is a rather new phenomenon in the 21st century that has destroyed the Fourth Amendment and many other parts of the Constitution, is concerning. I'll be the first to tell you the fact that we have a war machine in the country that basically, like a vampire, siphons the lifeblood of Americanism and has a sophisticated media and political apparatus which convinces the American people that wars fought thousands of miles away from their homeland are their moral obligation to undergo, which in all reality is the opposite. And those who argue against it are called isolationists and they are attacked. That's concerning. The fact that we have a generation of teenagers hooked on social media apps whose minds are being reduced to mush, who are using terms like Riz and other terms I don't want to expose you good people to. Riz is the modern day term for charisma. Go figure. I just found that out a few days ago. Who knew? This is concerning. The fact that we have this in juxtaposition with China, whose youth are much more smarter, much more determined than American youth, that's concerning. And I can keep going on and on and on. The fact that we have riots that are sanctioned by certain political parties in America, especially on the left, that are unleashed whenever a particular flashpoint event happens in American history. And the fact that so many different revolutionary ideologies that seeks to control the discourse in America are fueled by violence and innocent people are left hang out to dry even by the authorities, that's concerning. The fact that we have the police able to take your property without due process or detain you without due process, that's concerning. There are so many different things to be concerned about in this country, and much of it thanks to the political left. Having said that, there are two ways that I think we can evaluate the case for American optimism. Because there are two ways in which the bad things about our society are being talked about. And I've noticed this throughout my observations. The first way, I will call it on the way of longitude, the way of long-term patterns. Now, when you think of things in long-term patterns, you don't think of things in the concrete. You think of them how they have generally been throughout time. Like, for example, a trend that has happened in 1900 and how it ended up happening in 2000. Long-term patterns don't necessarily reflect the intimate reality on the ground that each of us in our everyday lives experience, but they reflect a general sense of how things are going according to what we read and we experience in the abstract. This is where a good majority of this pessimism comes from. Then we have the sort of concrete manifestations which impact our outlook on things. So I'll call this the ground level view. And in the ground level view, you will see these different events that are shown on social media, these different events that are shown in certain sectors of social media that make us just shake our head and catastrophize these events throughout the whole country. For example, there's been a very serious thing happening in education where indoctrination, as opposed to the refinement of the intellectual and moral powers of the pupil, which is the classical conception of education and the only just use of education, has become mainstream, where there have been gender ideology and there's been race ideology inserted into the education curriculum, or if not in the curriculum, in the school libraries as a means to circumvent, or if not in the libraries, as an informal means by certain ideologically possessed teachers to circumvent the training of the kids and the pupils. There's been a sort of a tension between the conception of parenthood undertaken by some activist teachers who will tell kids who believe they're transgender that they are not necessarily belonging to their parents. They are instead belonging to them, the teacher, who is their new family. That kind of stuff is very commonplace. It happens a lot. And this has been amplified by social media. But I would tell you, the ground level view would say this is happening all across America. And while this is happening, and it certainly is a problem, if you go out to a school in Wyoming or in Idaho, they probably don't have the same problems that this kind of agenda is pushing in schools in Chicago and New York. But the ground level view can only see what's happening in the concrete, and it will then take what's happening in the concrete and extrapolate it to a broader way, even if it is not reflective of the general reality of America. Twitter, social media does this immensely, and that is why I find this whole talk of black pills and white pills to be utterly and totally silly. Because many of us look at the condition of the country on the basis of what passes us on our social media feeds or what passes us in news articles. If you go to a town that is known for being high crime, for example, but you're in a particular neighborhood of that town that is not known for being high crime, and you're surprised, you'll say, well, I read on the news, this town is high crime. What's going on? You'll be surprised because your entire conception of that town was from what you heard. Chicago has a lot of crime. I've been to Chicago many times, though. There are parts that are nice that do not have that same issue. It's normally sectioned off into certain issues. But I thought going into Chicago that the whole city was a den of crime and evil. It's not. There are parts of it that actually are pretty good, and there are parts that are actually pretty sad. So on and so forth. Most of the pessimism of our country comes from this narrow viewpoint. Now, before I get off here, let me try to give you reasons to be optimistic on both the narrow viewpoint and also the long-term viewpoint. If we look at the context of American society in history, beyond the past 7 years, beyond what happened with COVID, beyond the riots, beyond the Patriot Act, beyond all these things that give many Americans pause, if we look at America in the context of a broader history, we actually have much reasons to be happy. Let's consider America between 1900, the beginning of the 20th century, and 2000, the beginning of the 21st century, and how we changed just over a 100-year period. Social mobility in America from 1900 to 2000 actually remained stable. Before the 1940s, for example, there was a lot of deaths that happened from non-farm populations. And those deaths, and also that lack of social mobility, constrained the economic potentials of people. But the deaths of those people fell after 1940 as technology progressed, people progressed. But overall, social mobility in America has remained stable. A lot of folks will say, well, the middle class is locked in the middle class. That's not necessarily the case. Social mobility has remained stable. That means your ability to succeed in America is roughly the same as it was 100 years ago, if not different, depending on the situation you come from. That's fundamentally positive. Infant mortality has significantly declined from 1900 to 2000. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, I'm putting for a report here, for every 1,000 live births, 6 to 9 women died of pregnancy-related complications, and approximately 100 infants died before their first birthday. Between 1900 and 1930, maternal mortality rates were the highest in the century. And of course, this changed. At the beginning of 1900, the average life expectancy for a white man was 46 years old. The average for a black man was 32 years old. The average for a white woman was 48 years old. The average for a black woman was 33 years old. In 2000, those same groups, the average life expectancy for a white man in 2000 was 74 years old. The average for a black man, 68 years old. The average for a white woman, 79 years old. The average for a black woman, 75 years old. That is a multi-fold increase just over the course of 100 years, which in the context of history is so short. But we quite literally raised the standard of living, increased human progress in this country, and managed to extend the lifespan across races and across generations. Isn't that amazing that we did that here in America? Babies also died less as well. There was a 60.3% increase of life expectancy in white men. There was a 109.84% increase in black men in life expectancy from 1900 to 2000. That is absolutely amazing. That shows how far American society has come. Moving on. The economy has also changed for the better as well. The economy has empowered something called entrepreneurship, which in past generations was still existed, but wasn't as prominent, nor was it really as attainable for a lot of people, because they had to go through a lot of different channels that were oftentimes centralized and controlled by people. But now, the sort of decentralized age of the internet has actually opened up success and well-being to more people than ever. For example, recently, more internet jobs, 38%, this is over the past 10 years, were created by firms and self-employed individuals than by the largest internet companies, which generated 34%. So on the internet, generally, if you were like back in the 90s when the internet age was just coming about, if you wanted to have a job on the internet, you generally had to either go independent, which is very hard, or you worked for a major company. Those same companies, which dominated the same sector I'm talking about 30 years ago, only generated 34% of internet jobs, whereas independent individuals like you and me generated 38%. The gatekeepers have fallen. This is in America. Going on. In the creator economy, which is what this is. This is what my channel is. This is what a lot of your favorite YouTubers and influencers who feed you this nonsense. This is what they do. In the creator economy, there were 200,000 full-time equivalent jobs. This number is short of the combined memberships of craft and labor unions across America. Just a little bit short of it. The fact that you have independent creators who have risen up over a system that has told workers that you need us to fight for you, and if you don't have us to fight for you, you're screwed, is the greatest testament to the strength of the American economy and the American spirit that I have seen ever. Again, this is today. This is in America. Education. More people are learning things online than they have ever before. The barriers to getting information have been torn down. A great majority of Ivy League universities put their educational resources online, which has empowered parents to be able to take their kids from failing systems and failing zip codes and then siphon them into systems where they can actually succeed. It's why you have seen the black graduation rate in America increase sevenfold, because you have seen this ability to change around education and to customize education. It's not perfect, of course, but the decentralization of information has brought forth this tsunami of greatness, which has allowed American youth to be better educated. Even though we are lacking behind in the global ranks, American youth have the ability, and in some cases they are, in certain areas, becoming more educated today than they were before. These are just a general long-term, over 100 years, over 30 years, over 20 years metrics of how the nation is doing. And people will say, well, Christian, what about this? What about that? The point is, if you're going to counter this information with negative information, you are completely and utterly missing the point. How you see these things are going to be almost as important than what's happening. If you see the cup half full, you're going to be able to appreciate what I'm saying. If you see it half empty, none of this stuff's going to matter, even though we have kids living longer on average, we've got more education, we've got more prosperity in so many different ways. Now, I will say this. The lifespan did decrease shortly between 2020 and some other years because of the COVID pandemic and because also of sedentary lifestyles and bad eating habits. But generally, the increase in lifespans has been significant, and it has the ability to continue if Americans get healthier, which we have the ability to do, regardless of what Big Pharma does or whatever. So when I see pessimism, I'm thinking to myself, okay, pessimism that is a critique of one's nation, a critique of how it could be, that's good. But pessimism that ignores the advances that one's nation, a new nation that has not even been alive for 300 years, a new nation which should have fell a long time ago, that beat out the rest of the industrialized world in so many different metrics, that is phenomenal. That is stunning, and it has led us to lives where we have the ability to complain for a living on the internet and be blackpilled when 50 years ago or 60 years ago, your ass would have been in the fields or your ass would have been in the factory working your ass off. You wouldn't have time to complain. That is how exponential the growth of America is. It has literally given us the comfort to kill ourselves, in a sense, by consuming negativity, by consuming brain rot, and by indulging in leisure as opposed to working, which is, by the way, a bad thing. But it's also a good thing because it shows you just how far we've come as a country. The case for American optimism is not just built in looking at long-term things or by contextualizing ground-level thinking. The case for American optimism, my friends, is built from understanding the heritage that you and I as Americans, philosophically, values-wise, inherit. It's easy and it's reasonable to be upset at the current state of our country. But when the events of the modern day, as terrible as they may be, are cast in the context of American history, beyond the 100-year lifespan I just gave you, in general American history, our troubles, they seem small in comparison to what our ancestors had to deal with in their lives. Just 80 years ago, Americans under a war, which again, I'm not entirely sure was a war we should have fought, but World War II, were forced to ration food, gas, and resources to support a war effort that only tangentially benefited them. They were told by their own president, FDR, that if they decided to keep their hard-earned money or keep their property, they were riding with Hitler. That's what the advertisement said. They were propagandized through cartoons, through movies, with explicit consent of the entertainment industry to push this effort at the behest of the government 80 years ago. A decade or so before that, here's where it gets interesting. Americans were struck with drought, famine, and economic destitution, which led to the worst economic period in our history called the Great Depression. A decade before that, the judges and divines and politicians of the progressive era decided the Constitution was secondary to their sociological projects and agendas, and in the form of the progressive era, radically restructured the form of our system to leading to ideological prosecutions like we have seen with President Trump. The progressive era was the one point in our history that literally detached the American system of justice and law from sound natural law, morality-based jurisprudence to sociological judicial activism, which has led to so many of the abuses, the two tiers that I hear all the time happening today. A few decades before that, a period of prosperity was unleashed in America called the Gilded Age, where innovation and creativity combined to lift scores of people out of poverty and into the industrialized world, where Standard Oil and so many different institutions that may have been good or bad, who knows, helped increase the level of progress that us as Americans had. Gone were the days where horse manure were what was stinking up our cities and reducing the quality of life and reducing the creative potential of American men and women. But a few decades before that, our country almost perished amidst the bloodiest domestic conflict that we have seen in our soil. Had our ancestors in the Union not prevailed, America would have been a distant memory, a nation that did not even last 100 years from its conception. The Civil War was won in 1865. America was founded in 1776 and officiated in 1787. If we had lost the Civil War, we wouldn't even made it 100 years. How amazing was that? Imagine what your favorite influencer, or your favorite doomer politician, or your favorite YouTuber would have said during any one of these periods or any one of these catastrophes. There's a civil war. We're all going to die. Oh my gosh, guys, there's a civil war. There's famine and doubt. America is doomed. There's rations. Everyone will starve. There's corruption at the highest levels. This isn't the country we're meant to be. The Constitution is dead. Because those things were said, by the way. Those things were said at various pieces in our history by people who wanted to give up. But the words I just uttered to you, my friends, are not the words of people who inherited a mighty intellectual tradition rooted in the telos of man and his ability to innovate and adapt when disaster strikes. They are reflective of weak minds who lack moral conviction, historical perspective, and a human urge to improve. America defied the course of history by its mere existence. A society based on contract, not status. One which gave man, or recognized rather, that man had spiritual value, not just material status to serve some ruler, was not only atypical in the stream of history, it was almost ahistorical, because no civilization before America had conceptualized this into political and social form, and yet we did. We were not supposed to exist as Americans. And we were not supposed to persist in the future, where a world was dominated by old world mindsets, to flourish and succeed. But we did. And we became the superpower. And even if people believe that we are in decline right now, we still have the ability, channeling the fervor and the fire and the passion and the conviction of our ancestors, to succeed where we may be failing. But we only succeeded this so far because our ancestors did not give up. Will the struggles of our ancestors have been in vain? So long as I live, the answer will be no. I don't care how many of you argue with me. I don't care how many of you say, Christian, you're 24 years old, you don't have an experience to make this. I don't care. I don't care what you say. As long as I live, my ancestors who went through something that many of you would have not been able to go through, that I would not have been able to go through, thinking about it, they didn't give up. And because of them, I'm here. I owe an unwritten commitment to them, by my own admission, to make sure that the project that they sustained for so many years is continuing and continues to progress throughout the ages, unceasingly. What about you, though? Will you give up on the America that your ancestors fought to preserve? Or will you channel their spirit and foist our country into the future? There's also reason, before I close, I'll say this. There's reason to be optimistic in terms of public opinion. During the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, most Americans were for it and they were deceived. But after Americans saw how they were being deceived, now a majority of Americans in both parties are skeptical of war. Most Americans at the height of the Patriot Act, where our privacy was taken away, were entirely in support of sacrificing privacy for security. Now Americans in both parties oppose that very sentiment. My friends, the only pathway forward is a pathway of hope and optimism. Otherwise, you are resigning yourself to a fate that should belie no American, because it is not American. It is fundamentally anti-American. Reject pessimism and embrace the new era of American optimism, and our country will become what it should have been a long time ago. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. I love you guys so much. Study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive.